Hey everybody, it's Bookshore. Today I have an interview with writer George Salis. George Salis is a great author who wrote See Above, Some Below, and whose book has been making the round on Instagrams and even got blurbs from people like Alexander Theroux and other authors that he's going to name right now. Me and
Ricky
George,
Ducournau.
yeah, and who else?
Who else? Well, those are the top 2, I think.
There you go. And we've become pretty good friends since I met him on Instagram. And he has an upcoming book called Morphological Echoes, which is something I've read some segments of, and I'm pretty excited about. Um, George, do you want to talk about your book a little bit?
Well, I've been working on it for 5 years and counting, which is a pretty long commitment. Starting to feel like a marriage that I wanna be over with because I have, the 3rd one already planned, but, the subtitle for it is actually a chaosmic mosaic, borrowing a little bit from Joycean, Wakean language. And it's, of course, impossible to describe because it's going to be a maximalist uh, novel in every sense of the word. But there's flashbacks to historical time periods in 1940s Japan, 9/11 New York. We get a scene of the Titanic sinking. There are stories on the moon. It actually opens up on the moon. Uh, it just plays with the concept of multiple dimensions, different versions of stories that happen in those dimensions, other universes, other planets. So the scope is fairly ambitious.
And I know comparing to authors is always kind of arbitrary, but from what I've kind of gleaned from it, it's like if you took, to some degree, Louise Borges' book of imaginary animals and put
Mm.
it through the wacky filter of like Pynchonesque wacky scenes, and also the Theroux list, and you just have this very dense prose that like combines the real world and mythology and really blurs the line between the two of them.
Those 3 are 3 authors I really love. So those are definitely influences you'll be able to pick up on. And of course, there's Salman Rushdie, been a huge influence from the beginning and continues to be. I think the novel combines the sort of mythological style of storytelling, people sitting around a campfire and telling uh, these sort of proto stories of myths about beasts and how the world came to be. And on the other side of that, we have the more modern style that you might find from Joyce to modern day stream of consciousness. And also, David Foster Wallace is a huge influence because Infinite Jest taught me how tragedy can be enhanced by comedy, and his hysteria is both hysterical and sort of heartbreaking at the same time. And it's hard to deny that influence as well.
Awesome. And so let me just ask you like the first question. Because talking to you, you're a fan of like heavy metal music and movies and everything like that, and you have a
Mhm.
wide range of interests. So why did you choose literature as the medium to get your ideas out?
That's a great question. And in fact, the earliest career dream I had was actually to be a film director. And the thing is, to make a film, essentially, you need an army or a vast set of skills, time, and patience on your own to make a film. And simply put, it's easier to write. All you need is a computer, uh, Word document. But of course, that's not the only reason I chose to write fiction. The other bigger influence is because I love language, and that's something you don't really get in film. Say, if you try to adapt um, a book into a movie, what you're missing out on is the prose style, unless, of course, the novel is written in a kind of script style, and then that actually might end up being a better movie.
I think yeah, I know what you're saying because I think with I haven't watched it yet, but Don DeLillo, another author we both love,
Mhm.
wrote a movie, and like some of the criticism was like it's like an author writing a movie, and it had too much like I think it had like too much language in the movie, which would never be a problem with novels, obviously, but
You're
yeah,
talking about David Cronenberg's Cosmopolis adaptation?
maybe no, not the. I think DeLeo wrote a script for a movie actually.
Oh, okay. Yes, I haven't seen that yet.
Cronenberg adapted Cosmopolis.
He did,
It's interesting.
and it has Robert Pattinson in the lead, but to me, it just felt like some cold pudding of a movie to adapt Vladimir Nabokov's phrase for The Wake. His dialogue doesn't translate well into a film setting. Maybe a play, because his latest, The Silence, I think would work great as a play, and he actually wrote a play. So,
Actually, when you said his dialogue doesn't transfer well into a movie, I was thinking the silence right now. That would be so weird to hear spoken aloud.
maybe if it was like a hyper experimental movie, not something that's so traditional like David Cronenberg tried.
Right, and that's the tough thing too. Is like when you talk about this stuff, because DeLillo has so much realism to him as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's like, like DeLillo's able to have that proper mixture, but like we're talking about, with putting into a movie, it's gonna be one or the other.
I want to see David Lynch maybe try to adapt a DeLillo work, but
Well,
who doesn't love David Lynch? He can adapt anything, right?
yeah. Well, since except for Star Wars, he said he looked at Chewbacca and felt sick.
Oh my gosh.
um, but since we're on that topic, let's go into another question I have. Because you expressed to me that you had interest in like your book turning into a movie. On the
Mm.
nature of adaptation, like who would you want to see direct it necessarily, and also what scenes would you be comfortable being cut out or having some liberty taken with?
Well, I feel like if I were to cut out scenes, then I should have cut them out from the novel itself. But the novel is written in such a way that it kind of mimics Cloud Atlas's structure,
Mm,
and defying all expectations, it was actually adapted into a beautiful movie that actually might rival the original source.
mm,
So, with Cloud Atlas in mind, I wouldn't mind if the Wachowski siblings adapted See Above, Sun Below into a film and have sort of the crisscrossing narratives like they did in that movie. Or another example is Magnolia, that has the crisscrossing narratives. I think there's some others.
yeah, I can't think of them right now. I haven't watched too many movies lately, but I'm gonna watch Godzilla vs Kong, but that probably doesn't apply to you.
High art.
High art, yeah. And speaking of high art, you did skydiving and you're not to write about it if you're not. Could you tell me about your experience with skydiving?
Well, what was notable about that was the fact that I'm scared of heights,
What's
and and even just say looking over a tall building or looking up at a tall building at the wrong time or at the wrong angle, I'll feel some sense of vertigo. I mean, it's not a phobia, it's not too debilitating, but I actually had a legitimate fear that I might splatter on impact. And in fact, when I went skydiving before I was attached to my instructor, he said, "Oh, you should have seen it. My first parachute failed." And then he had to pull the backup. I'm like, "Okay, thank you for telling me that right
yeah.
before we go." Uh, but here I am. I survived, and it was an amazing experience. And I would, in fact, do it again.
Hmm,
Maybe in a place like Greece or something where I can get even more of a
hmm.
beautiful vista to look around at. But
Now,
the thing was, I didn't want to be a fraud writing about skydiving, but never having done it. And
right.
so I just had to suck up that fear and be shot out of a plane. And one thing I learned from that was I actually didn't have to change so much my description of skydiving,
Hmm,
which makes me more confident about my ability uh, to use inference and intuition and just my imagination as a writer to depict something. So, say I have a story set in Japan with echoes. I don't necessarily have to fly to Japan to do that. You
or
know,
grew
there's
up
other
in
ways to do
or
research.
grew up in like 1940s Japan or be a caveman hunting a mammoth.
Time travel and all that. No, it's not completely necessary.
No, that's something interesting because when your character Adam has skydiving, he almost has like a pseudo religious spiritual experience, however you want to phrase it,
Hmm.
with the seeing the angel. And McElroy talks about something kind of similar when he sees the rocket launch. into space, where it was like the most religious experience he's had.
Mm.
Did you have like the same kind of deal with that, or were you just too afraid of death at the moment?
Um, I mean, I noticed people packing the parachutes after they were dropped because you have to fold them up again and make sure that all the air is taken out of them so that they expand fully with no problems. And the way they pack it, they lean on the parachute almost like a Muslim praying on the prayer mat.
Hmm.
And so I took note of that, and just the fact that when you're skydiving, you're almost between heaven and earth. And, the fall, it plays on the mythology of the fall, which we see echoed throughout all kinds of mythology. We have the fall of capital M, man. We have the fall of Humpty Dumpty. We have the fall of Satan. We have the fall of Icarus. So all of that coalesced into the novel.
That kind of constant downwards trajectory. You never there's very anything except for maybe like the figures of the Messiah, of like of rising. Everything
Hmm.
else is designated to falling.
Exactly.
Awesome. Now let me just pull up some questions I had here. Um, all right, so another big thing that you have in your work that I know might influence how you read other works as well
Mm.
is cliches. You do not like
Cliches, yeah.
cliches. What kind of led to that exactly? And also, I'm gonna give some example questions afterwards, but why do you hate them so much?
Well, a cliche, simply put, is lazy.
Mm,
It's the first thing that comes to our mind. It's a prepackaged plastic way of communicating. It's safe, it's comfortable, it's surface level, and so it doesn't belong in anything like an artful novel, an artful movie. It has its place. There may be that may be the reason we see it in so much genre fiction, commercial fiction, because it's comfortable. It doesn't intellectually engage with you at all. It's just something that can pass over the eyes, and you have an easy breezy read. Um, of course, there's exceptions such as dialogue to make it more natural. People talk in cliches all the time. That's just how it is. But for me, when I'm writing, there are two methods I use to make sure I don't fall into that easy trap. Uh, First of all, it's just a hyper consciousness, or maybe just regular consciousness while I'm writing, and stop myself as I'm writing a sentence or a phrase that's been heard before, and then meditate on it for a few moments or however long it takes to come up with something that actually stimulates the brain. And then, of course, there's the act of rereading what I've written and just looking out for these phrases that are just, uh, they don't elicit anything. It's just the first thing, the first instinct that you write is going to be uh, most likely a cliche or something that doesn't really tell the story as well as it should, or the sense.
it's almost like getting a canned apology in a sense. Like, I'm sorry I did this to you. It's like, well, everybody says that.
Hmm.
Now,
Hmm.
let me ask you this. Let me challenge you a bit on this, because not that I disagree, but
Sure.
what would be, and I know it'd be tough to put the delineating line, but what if somebody like dressed up a cliche? Like, with how to what extent can you change it where it's not
Mm.
cliche? So, example, I
Perfect.
thought of last night. Her heart is cold as ice. We hear that all the time.
Oh
Her heart is a
gosh.
tundra. That's pretty similar. Shackleton wouldn't even be able to navigate her heart. At what point, if you dress up the cliches enough, do they not become cliches? Is that acceptable to you, or is it still that lazy mode of writing just in a new dress?
It depends on the context. That is one way of getting rid of a cliche is using synonyms. That's maybe the easiest way, but more often than not, the result is going to be something that's awkward or obviously someone who just broke out a thesaurus to
Right.
use the cliche. You'll see that and say, oh, okay, he or she pulled out the thesaurus to change it from a cliche into something else. It can work sometimes. It just depends on the context.
Right. And I know that's like the really difficult thing, with, like putting an exact line there, because it's going to be different.
Mhm.
Like, we have hundreds of words and like context before and after that.
I was actually just reading The Self-Devoted Friend by Marvin Cohen, and he does exactly that. He plays with cliches in a way that's humorous and in a way that's artful. So this is just one example or two examples of Marvin Cohen playing with cliches to create something, elicit something in the brain that isn't just latent.
Or
And
an
here you
intellectual
go.
joyride, as they'd say.
What'd you say?
An intellectual joyride, as they'd say. Go for it.
The joyride of intelligence.
Yeah.
Uh, so reading from it, he justifies his inactivity under the motto "better latent than never."
Mm.
And there's this hilarious section on sneezes, and it ends with "wring out the nose and drench in the dew." It's an echo of bringing the new and out
Oh,
with the old.
out with the old. Yeah, that's it.
Something like that. Yeah, yeah.
Don't throw the cliche out with the bathwater.
And the best way, and aside from changing this and using synonyms to change a cliche, I would recommend an emphasis on etymology, mining words for their original source, their original meaning. For example, the word muscle actually comes from the word for mice or mouse because
Really?
they thought that it looked like when a muscle moves under the skin, it looks like there's a mouse or mice underneath.
Well, for your muscles.
And and if you wrote that, if you say, well, as he flexed, a herd of mice crawled across his back.
Mm.
That's something new.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I think those are all great examples. Let me go to the next question. Oh yeah, you talked about intuition in writing, and how did you develop that intuition? Or like, besides the skydiving, how did you learn to trust that a bit more?
Well, not to be obvious or mundane about it, but it comes with practice over time, learning to trust it. Skydiving was one example. Also doing academic research. Say I wanted to read about everything about ancient Egypt, but I ended up with the perfect book that sort of just brought it together and made me comfortable writing about ancient Egypt. And then, of course, doing some more research later on. But the key is to get to that point where you feel comfortable and you don't really know until you're there.
Hmm. It's kind of like in music where they talk about like trust your ear. Like you can
Mm.
get into the theory work of it, but sometimes you just have to trust your ear and where it goes for that and everything.
An ear can be something you can rely on with fiction too, as you read back your fiction to yourself.
Now, how do you feel about reading it back at the same time too? Because I know some pieces of work are more meant to be read than said aloud as well. I know Joyce specifically wrote Ulysses, so it can be read aloud with like a Dublin accent. Um, do you think about that with a lot with your work, or do you just go for it?
I'll write a little bit, say a paragraph, or whenever I'm losing steam. There's your comfortable cliche as we're talking. Whenever I'm losing steam, or I feel like okay, I've hit this point, and I'm going to reread what I just wrote to myself. And and then every day when I'm ready to start writing again, I'll reread from the beginning of the chapter, the section of the story, and until I get to the point where I left off, and then I'll start writing again. And it's this method that allows me to basically have a finished product by the time I'm done. I guess you could say it's editing and writing at the same time.
That's interesting because I know Delaney talked about in a lecture that he's a terrible writer, but
Mm,
he's a great rewriter. And a
mhm,
lot of authors will talk about like, yeah, this is several drafts, and just vomit stuff onto the page. And when I've tried my small hand at writing, I've done that as well, just literary vomit on it, and cliches and
mm.
all. But you said that, yeah, you for the most part, your first take is the take that gets into the final draft.
Because technically it's not the first take, but it kind of is. I mean, it depends because I am rereading, but as I reread, I don't really have to make huge edits. It really just depends on if there's a cliche there, or maybe I need to alter the scene so that it can transfer better to the next scene. But I don't envy writers who have to keep rewriting, rewriting, rewriting. And
Right.
maybe that's just a symptom of uh, a lack of confidence, or
Mm,
a fear of failure, or a fear of completion.
mm.
But I don't really struggle with any of that.
And that started from See Above, Some Below as well? Like, that's how you wrote that book as
Mhm.
well? So that was
And and
out of the
and
gate.
you'll notice that there's these sort of, I don't want to say bite-sized, but there's the sections that trade off between chapters and See Above, Some Below, and I'm sort of expanding that to a macroscopic and microscopic level in Morphological Echoes. But it makes it easier to tackle these beasts, or this beast, this Echoes beast, by doing it in chunks. And because stories, people say, have to be perfect, well, novels can be shaggy and whatnot. But when I tackle it piece by piece, I can make sure it's as perfect as can be, whatever that means. I mean, it's a subjective
Right, because you say you only
knowledge.
write, like, about 300 words a day or so, correct?
Yes, it depends, but about 300 a day. But I'll take long stretches of breaks if I need to. I try not to beat myself up over not writing.
Okay, so maybe that's, like, also kinda led into the process where maybe authors are trying to get, like, a larger word count within a day or something, like, you
Yeah.
find just being, like, focused on these 300 words and leaving it at that.
The muse is a fickle thing. You can poke it too much, but also you can let it sleep too much. So it goes back to that intuition again. Norman Mailer called writing the spooky art. You'll get these little micro revelations as you're writing. At least for me, you'll get these revelations as you're defecating on the toilet. You just have to be uh, uh, receptive to when it will happen, if it will happen. But at the same time, plenty of it won't happen if you don't just sit down and write.
So just, like, pretty much just buckle up and do it in some regards.
It depends. There's this fine line. I mean, whatever works for you as a writer. I
Mm,
have my method. It's not necessarily going to work for other people.
right. Let me get to the next question here as well. Um, okay, so this is kind of could be a combination question. I've
Mhm.
heard your work described as surrealist. I don't know if personally I would necessarily agree with that, but I know that you're acclimated to surrealist fiction as
Mhm.
well. Would you put your work in that category?
Well, it depends on how we define surrealism. I think the simplest definition is having two words, two concepts, two images paired together that normally wouldn't be paired
Like
together,
a ready-made.
maybe only in a dream. And I do, in the sense of having writing that's evocative, I do try to make those pairs on the level of the sentence, and of course on the level of imagery and scenes. And you'll find sort of that dream imagery throughout See Above, Some Below, in my current novel that I'm working on.
Right, and maybe if you go back to, like, Andre Breton's definition, and, Breton should be taken with a grain of salt because he was a major a-hole even in his own community, but he said that, surrealism shouldn't be referential, and a part of me kind of agrees with that because when I think of stuff like Joyce, Joyce's work, I like it can be surrealist in the sense that it's weird, but at the same time, it's so referential. It's not that necessarily automated writing that you get with other surrealists, or that disconnection of that of heuristics. It's a very conscious playing and putting together images, like you said, um, which would be, I would say, would be more like the cognitive processes. What
But
did you
by
take?
referential, what do you mean by that? By being conscious of trying to organize these thoughts into something rather than letting it flow out?
Referential in the sense of referencing another work, or like another piece of symbolism and whatnot. So like how you reference mythology in
Mhm.
your work.
Yeah, that's strange to say, but it shouldn't be. I mean, otherwise you're writing in a void, and it's literally impossible to shed every influence, whether it be a memory from being pushed out of the womb from the dark into the light. Anything is possible as an influence. So I don't even think this man Breton you speak of was able to defy his little prescription.
And if it's funny because like after that he does. analyzed one of his dreams, and he references and Nosferatu was in the dream, so that's a reference right immediately there. That I think makes that
Are
statement.
made from books, are made from books, are made from books. That that's a beautiful thing. It shouldn't be frowned upon. And I think it should be encouraged for readers and writers to be aware of everything that came before, so that they can build on it. Uh, Newton said, "Standing on the shoulders of giants," and I think that can also be applied to the giant writers of the past,
Hmm,
which includes Joyce.
hmm. Well, that goes great into my next question. It's almost like you're good at this or something. Um, so we've had the golden age of reading in the 1900s, where we've gotten people like Joyce who
Mm,
focus on Joyce and Wolfe who focus on that stream of consciousness and just really focusing on the particulars and the mundane of life. We've had McWoy who focuses on the cognition of thought and how that plays into our interactions on a micro and a macro scale.
mhm.
Pynchon with his use of systems and how systems are just too far beyond us. David Foster Wallace, like as you said, combining humor and tragedy. And we've had all these beautiful examples of taking literature and taking these concepts to a high end. And you're trying to do that in Morphological Echoes by, in my opinion, combining realism and mythology and having the boundary between literature and reality, kind of break away from each other. Where would you want to see contemporary authors go next with tackling these themes that 1900s authors didn't necessarily tackle?
Well, as far as David Foster Wallace's distinctness, I think that mostly falls on his prose style, which is a combination of sort of colloquial, slackered talk and then highfalutin academic. But to go to your main question, uh, it's hard to determine. I mean, where are the maximalist writers? Because I'm not fully aware of them. I know there's Adam Levin, who
Yeah.
wrote The Instructions and most recently Bubblegum, both of which I have yet to read, but I've heard mixed things. Eventually, I'll check them out. There's Lucy Ellman, who wrote Duck's Newburyport, which was a huge disappointment to me. But I mean, when the cover blurb says that forget about Ulysses, this is the new Ulysses. I mean, you're not off to a good start there. And I think the problem with her novel and with maybe more recent maximalist books in general is that, first of all, there's too many cliches,
Mm.
as we mentioned before, which if you cut out the cliches, then you don't really have a maximalist novel because now it's uh, 30,000 or more words shorter. Duck's Newburyport uses the phrase, the fact that I think 80,000 times or something like that,
Yes,
which is
Brian
the
was
length
talking
of a
about that.
novel in and of itself.
Yeah, she does that in lieu of periods to like have a stream of kind of a
Hmm.
stream of thought thing. And
Yes.
Joyce already did that with the Mary section at the very end of the novel, just a Molly Bloom,
Molly
a
Bloom's
long
monologue.
thing. Once I read the
I
manga, I'll
mean,
remember the characters. But
well, I mean, that brings us to the question of if anything is really original, especially when books come from books and whatnot. But I think it has to do less with trying to be original than just how you execute something that's already been done. You can execute it in a different way or combine it in a different way, and there you have something approaching originality. But going back to what I was saying, we have novel explosives by Jim Gower, which is sort of like an encyclopedia of cliches, and yet no one is talking about the fact that there's multiple cliches on every single page of its 600 some pages, which is somewhat concerning that people aren't talking about this.
mm,
And, I guess there's a number of psychological theories I could come up with, but my wife was just talking about how maybe people feel comfortable reading these big books that are written in such a way as to be easy to read, and they can feel good about that, even though it's not really in the tradition of full-blooded maximalism, as Stephen Moore used the phrase.
I would agree with you in a sense because like Naked Singularity, even though I really enjoy that novel, I still wouldn't put it on the level of like Pynchon and stuff like that. I don't want to
Hmm.
say I don't want to say maximalist intro novel,
Mhm.
because it's a good novel. It really is. But it's like at the same time, it's like we haven't had those authors that to rival the titans of like 50, 40 years ago. And
I'm not claiming to rival them, and my first novel is not maximalistic. It's a footnote in comparison to what I'm working on now,
mm,
but I will say that the flaws I find in Novel Explosives, Doug's Newburyport, you will not find those in what I'm working on now.
I'll keep an eye out
But
for all those. But let me just rephrase the question to like a fantastical situation. Let's say um, writing was like the major medium. Let's say
Mhm.
who cares about current maximalist authors? Where would you want to see literature go? Like what unexplored
The
reading?
easiest, and maybe this is trying to escape the question, but Morphological Echoes is where I want to see it to go, which is why I'm writing the novel in the
Mm,
first place. Toni Morrison said, "Write the novel you want to see in existence." That's what I'm doing. I'm the ideal reader, and people who share my aesthetics. I don't claim that it's going to be a bestseller that everyone will love it. If they did, then I'll wonder if I actually accomplished what I'm trying to do, which is write something that takes some work to enjoy, but is enjoyable nonetheless. It
right.
not in spite of the work, but maybe because of the work.
Mm, okay. And I heard that too in the music. I mean, I think it was Simon and Garfunkel who said like, we wrote music that nobody that we wanted to hear that nobody else was making.
Because I take a page. I don't want to say take a page, but I take influence from Alexander Thoreau, whose vocabulary is incredible, especially in Darkerville's Cat.
Mm,
And he makes a joke in one of his works saying, "Well, how hard is it to read Darkerville's Cat?" Well, it depends on how many words you know,
mm.
he tells the woman who's asking. So actually, the difficulty of echoes will just depend on how experienced you are as a reader. What's your vocabulary like? How willing are you to even look up words or references?
And that's kind of the problem with like Maximus novel in general, not with us, but like with the more normalized reader. Because like when I first got into pension, there was a bunch of people like, I don't get pension, I don't like it. Why do people read this stuff? But but it's more so like once you're more acclimated to that style and able
Mhm,
to understand that stuff, it's not as bad. My second reading of Gravity's Rainbow, it's like, oh, this is not as hard as it was the first time.
mhm.
So it just
And
kind
you
of goes
say
back,
not as bad, and by meaning not as difficult.
not as difficult. Yeah,
And people have this association of difficult as bad, and that's part of the problem here.
right,
Uh, I mean, if you want an easy read, don't read Pynchon, but
right.
you need to know what you're coming into and
Right,
be
and
willing to meet the author on their own terms. Uh,
it'd be like going into a David Lynch movie and saying, "Well, I didn't understand it."
mhm.
Like, well, that's what he's trying to get at. That's the whole effect of it.
Yes,
Or like,
people don't
when
want to don't want to have any intellectual engagement and to at least do half of the work.
right,
Uh, they want to be spoon fed.
right,
And going somewhat back to your question, there's an emphasis on clean, polished, safe literature. And when it's so clean and when it's so polished, it becomes a formula. And then literary fiction, it becomes a genre because it's so formulaic in that
mm,
sense. Uh, if anything, I want to see future writers take more risks, be more true to themselves, to their vision. Don't listen to your MFA workshop director or teacher. listen, listen to yourself. Build on the books you love. Interrogate the books you love. Read more of those kinds of books. Ask yourself why you love them. How do they work? What doesn't work? And build on it from there.
yeah, that's a good, interesting thing you said. I'm glad you said it because I remember watching a YouTube video where it's like, if you want to be a writer, read your contemporaries because people are reading stuff from the 1900s. It's already like 100 years old. That writing is old.
Mm,
But like, like you said, like people like Thoreau, or like we talk about Pynchon, or even Joyce, like their language to call that antiquated just because it's not of the modern day, you're missing out on like just gold mines of how to play with prose and how to
mm.
approach these words. And just to throw that out completely, just to read contemporary novels to be more sellable, just seems more like, as they would say in the metal scene, sellout.
There's so much to read, and I mean, people have their favorites saying you should read this, but at the end of the day, read what you love
Right.
And as a writer, especially read what you love. I don't know why a reader would read what they don't love, but as a writer, read what you love and interrogate it, as I said, and go down the rabbit holes. You don't have to read your contemporaries. You don't have to read anything that you don't want to read.
Right.
Uh, it would be nice to have read everything, but then what's the point of life afterward?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a race against time. There's too many books.
And we're losing. Like, um, and like that's a good point because Umberto Eco, very esoteric knowledge set, like with medieval studies and like semiotics, and he became a bestseller just based off of those aspects. He didn't become a bestseller by trying to write the Da Vinci's Code or stuff like. Even though he kind of did Foucault's pendulum, but anybody who read the Da Vinci's Code would not be able to handle Foucault's pendulum. I
I
read
mean,
it.
Da Vinci Code is Dan Brown trying to write Echo but failing, right?
Right. Oh, I think Echo said that one time or something like that.
Oh, really?
There's some controversy. I forget the exact thing, but I forget which one came first. But there was a little Echo was doing some jabs at him.
I mean, if you're writing something to become a bestseller, you're already starting on the wrong path.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean, it's the difference between writing for art and writing as a commodity.
Right.
People can make a living writing, but you know, I'm not interested in that and the results of that.
Also, if you're trying to make money, literature is probably not the best way to go about it. I remember you said like authors are kind of like the ballet dancers of the present day.
It was John O'Brien, rest in peace, of Dalkey Archive,
Hmm.
who said that publishing the kind of works we love has become something that is like ballet or opera. It's so a niche of a taste. People aren't like me and you. Not many people are reading Women and Men.
Yeah, and I
uh,
still haven't forgiven you for having me read this book now.
this is my fault.
Yeah, it's your fault. And I was gonna do it anyway. Do you think especially given the pandemic right now, and there's so many people like just consuming media right now? Do you think there's a chance to have a resurgence in that a bit? Like maybe in some ways where it can be compromised, where we're not going for the maximalist ideology of these 700-page books, but maybe something more like plus, like a very dense 200-page book. Do you think that has a chance at all, or not?
Well, the hopeful part of me wants to say, sure, why not? Being on Instagram and now Twitter and Goodreads, where I'm finally escaping the void of my reading and writing life and encountering other readers and writers who like similar things to me and introduce me to new work, and I introduce them to new work. I'm not sure how big this audience is but there's hope. Let's say that. But then again, I'm not going to go out of my way to try to convince, say, a young adult fan, a fan of young adult novels, try to convince them to read something I love. I mean, what's the end game of that?
Right,
Maybe
right.
one day, maybe you can make a recommendation, but we shouldn't have a crusade here where we're trying to get people to read McElroy just because.
And I think that's like the problem sometimes with people like in this more academic minded community. We focus so much on the huge books. That's why I did that 3x3 challenge where it's like, hey, let's talk about 200-page books that people love because I want to read McElroy. Cool. He wrote the biggest single volume in
Hmm.
American literature. Have fun. It's like, well, that's too much. Well, maybe start with like the letters to you and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Maybe start with
Hmm.
something like plus would be too difficult though. I struggle with that book, but
A
like
letter left to me.
letters left to me, yeah. Oh, sorry, letters left to you is a pop punk song, but like sometimes it's like we even no insult, but even like see above, sun below. I feel like that's a very accessible book and a very accessible page length. Um, that would,
And at the same time, it's the product of a love of Rushdie and DeLillo, even though
right,
I was 20 when I first started writing it, and I finished it when I was 23. So it is juvenilia in the pure sense of that word. But yeah, what you're getting at is certain books can be sort of gateway drugs to
Yeah,
the LSD of the bigger novels where writers are spending decades wrestling with their imagination, and it should be a privilege and an awe-inspiring spectacle to read these books. In theory, some of them don't quite
right.
work out.
Well, you brought up a good example. Lilo, I feel like he'd be a great access point because he has
Mhm,
a lot of small books as well, but you still get
mhm.
those the Liloisms and stuff like that. I think White Noise is one of the most beautiful books he's written. It's only 400 pages. So,
Yeah, that was that was my first Delillo, and it was wonderful. And I've read a handful more of him. I still have some that I'm saving for a rainy day. Uh,
so
but yeah, I mean we can encourage maybe younger people to start reading some of these more difficult, challenging books, and so that it could enrich their life
yeah.
in the long run. That might be one reason why to do that.
It, especially because there's this funny disconnect where, at least on the book community, because we still have places like Barnes and Nobles, which kind of amazes me, and local
Yeah.
bookstores. So like there, I'm not going to say it's huge, but there is a subset of and a passion for reading. Just a lot of just does seem to go to more like the young adult section and everything like that. So, and like I'm not helping either because I'm just reviewing big books this year. So, but like
Mhm.
maybe there could be a bit more push for like moderately to smaller books and stuff like that, but still have the same level of quality. So they
I
just don't
think,
get stuck on a Haruki Murakami.
as I understand it, time and time again, young adult outsells adult fiction every year.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, well, if you're starting with Murakami, who is basically a young adult writer and as popular as, say, J.K. Rowling or something, that can be a gateway drug. It was for you, right?
It was, but then I was also reading Borges at the same time, and
Mhm.
that's also a great gateway as well. But like, yeah, that's the thing with Murakami. Like, I think he's a great intro to understanding these concepts, but I just
Mhm.
feel like a lot of people don't seem to go past him at the same time. And I think,
Yeah,
little aside, I think there's a lot of it's positive, but reinforcement. I call it negative reinforcement. Was like Murakami's the best writer. So okay, well, I'm already reading the best writer and understanding that. There's no reason for me to go
yeah.
past this as well.
I I'm hesitant to declare anything like the best writer when there's so much I have yet to read, and
Right.
I don't think those declarations are very helpful. But what can be helpful is doing what we do, making these YouTube videos. The Kaleidoscope that I run is online publication. Just being passionate about the books we love, posting about them on Instagram, and eventually other people are going to see this and try out the books and maybe find a new love for themselves.
I just had somebody in another country today message me that they bought Short Rumbling. So that's
Exactly.
kinda cool.
Yep.
So
And
let's
after I did a podcast for the Satanic Verses, I've had at least 4 people tell me that they bought a copy or they're reading a copy. So it's
I just
great
want
to hear.
to tell people there's a little Easter egg at the end of that podcast. George says like it takes a lot of work to be offended by a 600-page book, and I was just remember just listening to that in my room like, yeah, it's a good argument.
Drop the mic.
Drop the mic. Yeah, it's like yeah, that's a good point. So do you want to get onto um some questions from the chat?
Sure.
Oh, so from Gabriel Hedibas, I probably said that wrong. Is there any Latin American author that you enjoy or really like? Who and why?
Oh, the first one that comes to mind is of course Borges. Uh, we both love maximalism, and yet he's a minimalist uh, a maximalist disguised as a minimalist.
Yeah.
His stories are much bigger on the inside than they are on the outside. And Ficciones, I think, is probably one of the best short story collections. Period. So that comes to mind. But if we want to talk about more buried Latin writers, there's Abel Passe, who I wrote about and interviewed on my site. And what's so validating is that a publisher, The Times Books, based in Dublin, Paris, um, read the interview, and now they're going to be translating a new novel by him, his novel that's set in Venice, I believe,
Hmm.
where he met Borges,
Oh, nice.
and possibly reissuing one of only the 2 novels of his that have been Englished. And that was, I think, the first one came out in the late '80s or maybe early '90s, and we haven't had any English work from him since. Englished.
That's awesome.
Why are
I'm
you
glad you
looking
got
into
that.
the camera like that?
I'm just checking the time to see if there's anything. Awesome. Next question by Waste Mailing List. How has your experience as a reader changed since becoming a published writer?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think it has changed at all, but starting the Kaleidoscope has changed my reading habits because now I'm writing my invisible books column, and so I'm always on the lookout for more invisible books, more neglected authors who might be available for an interview to heighten the column and have a better overall experience on the Kaleidoscope in general. And so even right now, I have a stack next to me of books by invisible writers who, depending on if I like them enough, will be featured on the site at some point in time.
Let's
Here's
see
a
what
little here's a little glimpse.
you got.
Lance Olson, Steve Tomasula, Alan Singer, who I have already covered, Lee Siegel.
Awesome. Next question by Lipchitz, Alex on Instagram. What three books would you bring to a desert island?
Oh my. Well, I feel like I'm gonna gravitate toward my top favorites, and why wouldn't I? Ulysses is one.
Hmm.
It's a what, around 600-page book, yet it reads like a 1,200-page book. I mean, there was a podcast on it. I can't remember the name of it, but he every week made a podcast about one line in
Yeah.
Ulysses, and it went on for hundreds of episodes, and he died before he could even finish it. So I think that'll uh, bring me many revelations to come as I'm trying to crack a coconut on the desert island. So that's one. Another one. I have to think about that. I want to say Infinite Jest,
I know
but
you
will it really bring me infinite jest for an eternity? I guess we'll have to find out.
did. So
And
Infinite Jest.
Infinite Jest. And the third one, I'd have to go with the Satanic Verses,
Oh, nice.
which I keep by my desk. Here we go. Salman Rushdie.
Cool. Now for part two of the question. And which two would you use for firewood to stay warm?
Oh my God. Or rather burn my clothes. Then again, if in a survival situation, anything goes. I have to answer that. I'm not answering that.
Specifically asked me to frame it in that
I'll
context.
send you a carrier pigeon if I end up being on a desert island. I'll let you know.
We have a question from Austin Kaiser. If you could live to be 200 and in good health, what would you do with your extra 100 years?
Well, I mean, they say writers die twice. First, the talent goes, then the body goes. I want to continue writing until I don't have anything left to write about.
Hmm.
But as we mentioned before, reading is a race against time. There's always more and more books to read and discover. So I would probably spend most of that time reading and trying to experience life as much as possible. I do want to go to the moon.
That's so random.
Well, it's not random. One of
Oh,
these days I want to go to the moon.
there's nothing there. It's just rock.
Oh, it's beautiful. Well, you can see the Earth. The Earth is there.
You can see the Earth on the Earth.
Not quite. Not quite that way. The pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan put it.
Awesome. Well, that's all of our questions. I do have one last question for you, though, because this is a favorite question that you like to ask in your interview.
Mm.
What books or authors would you want to see recommended more that are more unknown, that don't get the credit that you think they deserve?
Well, aside from telling people to go read my column on invisible books, I have this beautiful thing, Darkinville's Cat by
Mm.
Alexander Theroux, wrongly out of print for, what is it, over 30 years now.
Wow.
and I'm disseminating a samizdat ebook of it to people
Oh,
who
really?
email me and say they want a copy because I have an illicit ebook. And I would say about 10 people or more have contacted me about that. And if you're listening now, shoot me an email, I'll send it to you.
I was gonna say you didn't tell me that, but I think you did. But I still bought the physical copy because I'm stupid.
Well, that's not stupid. It's better to read physically if you can find a copy.
Right, right.
But Thoreau, he's almost anachronistic in his style,
Mm.
especially as a fighter against the apocalypse of words. There are more words in this novel than probably all the novels that have been published in the past 5 years.
Oh, the 5 years. Okay, I can say even more than Ulysses because I know Ulysses has like a huge word count in there. Like, oh,
Yes, more than Ulysses, though.
really?
If you compare the book to book, it has more words than Ulysses.
That's insane.
This is the book as far as a love of language. He uses words that even historians of language don't even know what they mean. Words
Really?
that haven't been used in 300 years.
Jeez. Oh, well, that's on my reading list for this year, so now I'm even more excited.
Mhm, mhm. It's maximalist in basically almost every way, except the story is, if you sum it up, it's just a love story uh, about unrequited love and revenge,
Hmm.
which isn't quite maximalist, but the
Okay.
way he executes something that isn't original becomes very original.
Well, I mean, at the same time, you can say the same thing with the Divine Comedy, like just
Mhm,
it's a
mhm.
love story about loss.
Yeah, that's why plot, in many cases, doesn't really matter, does it?
Yeah, except if you're 1,000 pages into Woman and Man, you want a little bit of plot.
Well, the downfall of that is repetition, I would say.
Yeah, definitely 100%. Well, awesome. Well, we got through all the questions. Do you want to read a passage from your novel so people can have a taste of what you're about?
Sure, sure. Phaethon, is that okay with you, or you want me to?
Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna count all the cliches.
Let's get a counter. You can do that. Put a counter up in the top
Yeah.
corner.
Yeah, if you could.
I'm going to be reading from the overseas paperback published by Corona Samizdat in Slovenia. I This is now being reprinted for the second time. So thank you to everyone who bought a copy and made it necessary to print more.
A lot of good reviews
And
out there.
huh?
A lot of good reviews on Instagram out there.
And as a thank you, the publisher and I have agreed to sell the copy now for €8 instead of 10. So if you haven't gotten one now, I suggest you go for it. So this is the chapter Phaethon. Adam's father didn't fall asleep, but simply fell from the sky, right foot over left foot, arms outstretched with palms exposed, head touching his shoulder. He opened his eyes and saw the world inverted. If anything, he was a light beam, photon struck and magnet pulled, perhaps possessing a wave function, perhaps not. But really, he was human, a truth hard to remember 20,000 feet above the earth. Up here, everything was covered in an orange haze, as though he was re entering the atmosphere, the world burning. Up here, while his skin heated to extreme temperatures, his entire body scintillated. He didn't fall asleep, even though this, his last jump, would be remembered as a secret metamorphosis. Up here, he was the atom among atoms. When you see how the universe is constructed, you can cease fighting it. But he now knew how futile such a notion was as he passed through them, their structure compromised, protons, neutrons, and electrons scattering. He tried to mold his being to this broken layer of existence, but he could not. As sparks radiated from his body in spirals, he was both solar entity and subatomic particle. The hydrogen and helium of his eyes held together by their own gravity, churned with nuclear fusion. His legs and arms, his heart and brain, all these would break into clumps of matter and be swept up by his eyes as fuel. The left eye blue shifted, the right red shifted. This time it wasn't safe to say that he didn't fall asleep. Not necessarily, because what happened or didn't happen next might have been simultaneously something and nothing, yet wholly different than anything he had experienced. He blacked out, hidden within the clouds as his own sun.
But yeah, that was a really beautiful segment, and those were my favorite segments in your book. And people, I gotta say, from what I read from Morphological Echoes, from what he talks about, if you like that kind of stuff, that's gonna be like all of Morphological Echoes. So definitely keep an eye out for that in like
Squared and cubed and hypercubed.
yeah, in 2024. No.
I'm trying to finish it within the next 2 years by the time I turn 30. But of course, that doesn't guarantee any publisher will take it. So if
Right.
you're an agent, contact me.
I'll post each page on my YouTube channel. So no. Okay. Well, thank you so much for talking with me, George. It was great talking. I'd like to pick your mind about writing and all these different topics. Do you have any last minute things you'd like to say?
I think that's about it. Thanks so much for having me, Ben. This is a delight.
Sounds good. So I'm gonna close this out and hopefully it saves. But yeah,
You
check out
better say
yeah,
fucking.
I'll be so mad. But check out George Salis. I'll link the Kaleidoscope and where you can buy his novels in the descriptions, and I'll link his Instagram as well. He's a really cool guy as well. And reach out to him if you have any questions and whatnot. And that should do it.